Galileo, Galileo, Galileo Figaro.
The room was dark, thick with cigarette smoke and uncertainty. It was the 1970s, and rock music followed rules everyone understood. Songs had verses, choruses, and clean endings. Singles were short. Radio decided what lived and what died. And then, without warning, a 6-minute track landed on a studio tape machine that broke every one of those rules at once. No chorus, no clear genre, no explanation. Inside the control room, there was silence, not admiration, but confusion. This wasn't just risky, it felt reckless. Opera voices crashed into hard rock guitars, choirs appeared out of nowhere. The song shifted personalities mid-breath, like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Some people thought it was genius. Others were convinced it would end the band's career overnight. At that moment, no one was calling it revolutionary. They were calling it unplayable. Executives would soon say radio would never touch it. Engineers worried the tapes wouldn't survive the process. Even the band itself wasn't fully sure what they had just created. It didn't sound like a hit. It didn't sound like anything that belonged in rock music at all. And yet, within weeks, this impossible song would explode across the world, not slowly, not cautiously, but instantly. Almost overnight, it would redraw the boundaries of what rock music was allowed to be. But what made this song truly dangerous wasn't its sound. It was the mind behind it, and what he was trying to hide inside the music. But the story of how this began goes back much further. Long before the world knew his name, Freddie Mercury was already living between two musical worlds. Rock gave him power, opera gave him scale. And unlike most artists of his time, he never believed he had to choose just one. Freddie didn't treat opera as background inspiration or dramatic flavor. He studied it. He absorbed its structure, the way characters collided, the way voices replaced instruments, the way emotion was exaggerated until it became theatrical truth. To him, opera wasn't old or elitist. It was raw emotion with no safety net. What fascinated him most was disguise. Opera allowed performers to hide personal pain behind characters, choirs, and exaggerated drama, and Freddie understood that instinctively. By the early 1970s, he was already building songs that masked intimacy with spectacle. He once described his approach as mock opera, but that phrase was misleading. This wasn't parody. It was camouflage. By the time Queen entered the studio to work on what would become their most infamous song, Freddie wasn't just writing music. He was constructing something layered, a story that could be screamed, whispered, laughed at, or misunderstood entirely. And that was intentional. Because if listeners couldn't pin down the meaning, they couldn't pin down him. But there was one problem. Turning that obsession into a rock single meant dragging the entire band into uncharted territory, whether they were ready or not. And not everyone was convinced this experiment would survive, especially when they heard the full idea. When Freddie finally played the song for the band, reactions were mixed and tense. No one doubted his ambition. What worried them was the fallout. This wasn't just unusual. It felt like a gamble with everything they had built. Brian May would later admit that the song sat on a knife edge. In his words, it was either going to be something extraordinary or a complete disaster. There was no middle ground. Roger Taylor questioned how it could ever work-live. John Deacon wondered how radio would even approach it. And behind all of that was a quieter fear no one said out loud. What if this is the song people laugh at? Queen had momentum, but they weren't untouchable yet. One misstep could freeze their progress. And this wasn't a misstep, it was a leap off a cliff. There were real arguments, not about talent, but about survival. Singles were supposed to sell albums. This one might do the opposite. Releasing it intact felt almost defiant, like daring the industry to reject them. Yet Freddie didn't flinch. He didn't ask for edits, he didn't offer explanations, he simply insisted that this was the song, all of it, or nothing at all. And that stubborn confidence forced the band into a decision that would define their legacy. But belief alone wasn't enough. Because the moment they tried to record it, they discovered the biggest obstacle wasn't artistic. It was technical. And it nearly broke the studio itself. Nothing about the recording process was normal. From the first vocal pass, it was clear this song wasn't built for the technology of its time. The operatic section alone required layers upon layers of harmonies stacked, erased, and re-recorded until the tape itself began to degrade. They weren't just recording vocals, they were constructing choirs from 4 human voices. Freddie, Brian, and Roger spent endless hours singing microscopic fragments, single words, syllables, breaths, knowing most listeners would never consciously hear them. Each take added weight, each layer pushed the limits of analog tape. Engineers watched reels physically wear down as the song grew larger and more complex. The studio became an instrument, and it was being pushed to exhaustion. At points, no one could even remember how many vocal tracks were already there. The control room lights stayed on late into the night as the band chased a sound they could hear in their heads but hadn't yet captured on tape. It was expensive. It was slow. And to some observers, it looked completely unhinged. Other bands would have simplified. Queen doubled down. Because for Freddie, complexity wasn't indulgence, it was necessity. Stripping it down would strip away the mask, and whatever this song was hiding, he wasn't ready to expose it plainly. By the time the final mix came together, the question wasn't whether it sounded good. It was whether anyone would understand it at all. And that mystery was about to collide with the outside world, starting with the lyrics no one could explain. Because once people heard the words, the speculation truly began. The moment people focused on the lyrics, everything became more complicated. "Mama just killed a man." That single line was enough to stop listeners cold. It sounded violent, confessional, and deeply personal, yet it was wrapped in theatrical delivery, layered voices, and sudden shifts in tone. Nothing about it felt literal, but nothing felt random either. And that contradiction became the song's greatest mystery. From the beginning, Freddie refused to explain what the lyrics meant. No interviews, no clarifications, no helpful hints. When asked directly, he brushed it off or redirected the conversation. That silence wasn't accidental. It was a choice. The song introduced characters, guilt, judgment, fear, and farewell, all without context. Listeners were forced to interpret it themselves. Some heard a crime, others heard regret. Many believed it was a symbolic death, the killing of an old self, to make room for something new. But what that something was remained frustratingly unclear. The operatic section only deepened the confusion. Voices seemed to argue with each other. Accusations collided with pleas for mercy, and just when the tension reached its peak, it vanished into silence. No resolution, no explanation. That ambiguity kept the song alive far beyond its runtime, because once a listener finishes the track, the story doesn't end. It follows them. And the unanswered questions only grew louder as the years passed, especially when people began re-examining Freddie's life through a modern lens. And that's where the rumors truly took shape. Decades later, the theories haven't slowed down, they've intensified. As public understanding of identity, pressure, and self-reinvention evolved, many listeners began hearing the song differently. What once sounded abstract now felt deeply internal. Not a story about violence, but about transformation, about fear, about crossing a line you can't step back from. Some believe the song represents a private reckoning, a moment when Freddie confronted a truth he wasn't ready to share openly. Others argue it reflects the collapse of an old identity, buried beneath operatic drama, so it could be expressed without being exposed. What makes these interpretations so powerful is not proof its absence. Freddie never confirmed them, and just as importantly, he never denied them. Friends and bandmates later suggested that Freddie often used exaggeration and performance as emotional armor. Instead of writing plainly, he hid behind scale, choirs, characters, noise. The bigger the production, the harder it was to see the wound beneath it. That makes Bohemian Rhapsody unique. It doesn't confess, it deflects. It invites you in, then refuses to guide you. And that refusal is exactly why the song keeps generating new meaning with each generation. It adapts as listeners change, absorbing their own fears, doubts, and questions. But while fans were busy interpreting the lyrics, there was another battle happening, one that threatened to prevent the song from ever being heard at all. Because meaning didn't matter if the industry refused to release it. And they very nearly did. Especially when the executives finally listened. When the finished track reached record executives, the reaction was immediate and brutal. The verdict was simple. Impossible. Too long for radio, too strange for mainstream audiences, too fragmented to classify. In an era where singles followed strict formulas, this song felt like sabotage. One executive reportedly said it would kill the band's momentum. others insisted it had to be cut down aggressively. Their logic was practical. Radio programmers wouldn't touch a 6-minute song. DJs needed structure. Listeners needed familiarity, and this track offered neither. The solution seemed obvious. Edit it. But Freddie refused. No shortened version, no radio mix, no compromise. He made it clear that the song only existed as a complete piece. Break it, and it lost its meaning. That defiance created real tension. This wasn't artistic debate anymore. It was control. The label hesitated. Releasing the song intact felt like lighting a match in a closed room, but shelving it meant crushing the band's confidence and possibly losing them altogether. Eventually, the song slipped through the cracks, not with a massive promotional push, but almost quietly handed to radio as an experiment no one expected to survive. And that's when something completely unexpected happened. Radio didn't reject it. Listeners didn't change the station. They demanded more. What followed wasn't gradual acceptance, it was instant impact. Because rock music didn't just bend that night. It broke and reshaped itself in the process. The reaction was immediate and completely unplanned. Once the song reached radio, something strange happened. Instead of switching stations, listeners stayed. Then they called. Then they called again. DJs who were warned the track was unplayable suddenly found their phone lines lighting up non-stop. People weren't asking for the edited version. They wanted the whole thing. Requests flooded in, not just once, but night after night. The song didn't creep into popularity, it detonated. Within days, it was impossible to ignore. Within weeks, it dominated conversations, charts, and living rooms. What was supposed to be career-ending madness became a phenomenon that rewrote expectations. Rock music had never seen anything like it. A single with no chorus, a structure that refused to behave, a song that demanded patience and rewarded it. And audiences didn't just accept it, they embraced it. Almost overnight, the rules collapsed. Radio proved it didn't need to be safe. Listeners proved they were willing to follow artists anywhere as long as the journey felt real. And Queen went from ambitious outsiders to something far more dangerous, a band without limits. But success wasn't the final twist. Because the song didn't just change how people listened to music, it changed how musicians thought about what was possible. And the shockwaves were only beginning. Because once that door opened, rock would never close it again. After this moment, the industry quietly shifted. Artists watched closely. If a 6-minute operatic rock song could dominate airwaves, what else had been labeled impossible for no real reason? Suddenly, experimentation didn't feel reckless anymore. It felt necessary. Studios transformed. They weren't just places to record songs, they became creative laboratories. Length stopped being a restriction, structure stopped being sacred. Albums became more cinematic, more ambitious, more personal. Rock didn't lose its edge. It gained depth. Queen's success sent a clear message. Audiences weren't as fragile as executives believed. They didn't need formulas. They wanted honesty even if it came wrapped in chaos, even if it took effort to understand. But here's the part many people miss. Countless artists tried to recreate that lightning. Longer songs, grand concepts, multi-part epics. Yet none of them truly replaced what this one track achieved. Because the secret wasn't complexity. It was risk. This song didn't succeed because it was clever. It succeeded because it felt like someone standing in front of the world without a safety net daring it to listen. And that kind of risk can't be copied. Which is why, decades later, no song has ever truly replaced it. Because what made it work wasn't just what we heard. It was what one man was willing to expose without ever explaining it. And that brings us to the heart of the story. Many musicians have tried to analyze the formula. They break the song into sections. They study the harmonies. They count the layers. But that approach always misses the point. This wasn't engineering. It was vulnerability disguised as spectacle. At its core, the song works because it feels unstable. It shifts moods because the person behind it was shifting too. It argues with itself. It panics. It pleads. Then it lets go. That emotional unpredictability can't be designed on paper. And that's why it remains untouchable. Freddie never explained the meaning, not because he didn't have one, but because explaining it would have collapsed the illusion. The mystery protects the emotion. Once you define it, you limit it. So instead, he left it open. Every listener brings their own fear, their own guilt, their own moment of change, and the song absorbs it without resistance. That's why it still feels alive. It isn't a relic of the 1970s. It's a mirror that keeps adapting to whoever stands in front of it. And that adaptability is what truly changed rock overnight. Not the opera, not the length, not the ambition, but the courage to release something unfinished, unresolved, and emotionally exposed. Some songs want to be understood. This one only wants to be felt. If this story changed the way you hear that song, even just a little, let me know in the comments what you think it's really about. Drop a like if you enjoy deep stories behind music, and subscribe if you want more untold Queen and Freddie Mercury stories that go beyond the surface. Because some music hides more than it reveals, and that's exactly why it lasts.